not sure if any of you watch The Daily Show on Comedy Central, but last week, host of The Daily Show, Trevor Noah, shared a story about during his vacation, he got to go back home to South Africa. And he said he was in his hotel room or wherever he was staying and said he got a phone call from a friend that said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Well, I have this engagement tonight, but nothing." He's like, "Cool." He goes, "The president wants to meet you." He said he responded, "Well, what president?" Because I wasn't sure. He goes, "Maybe it was the president of the PTA. I didn't really know." But it was the president of South Africa. A South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, wanted to meet him. And so he said that his friend came and picked him up. And then he said he actually on the way picked up a couple buddies of his. But he said in sort of all the excitement of it, he said he forgot to tell them where they were going when he picked them up. So he said he was dressed up because he had an engagement that evening, but when he picked his friends up, he said the one friend came down, he was wearing a hoodie, and the other friend comes down in just a t-shirt and with a jacket over it. So he said they're driving on the way there, and they pull up to the presidential palace. He said his friends were like, "Well, what are we doing here? Are we picking somebody else up?" He's like, "Oh no, we're going to meet the president." He said his one friend looks at him, he's like, "Dude, I'm wearing a hoodie." So he tells the story about they went in and they met the president, and when his friend walked up, he said, Mr. President, I am so sorry." He goes, "I'm so sorry I'm dressed like this." He goes, "I didn't know I was going to be meeting you today." He said the president graciously responded, "Well, I didn't know I was going to be meeting you guys today, so that's why I'm dressed like this." But see, I'm not sure about you, but I've never been summoned to meet anybody famous or important. Some of you maybe have better connections than I do. But probably the closest I've ever gotten was actually paying to meet somebody famous or important. A few years ago, I went to a Comic-Con and I met Jewel Staite and Alan Tudyk, who were in the TV show Firefly. Do we have any Firefly fans? It's from about 10 years or so ago. So I'm a brown coat. Today it's a brown sweater. But probably the only thing with that is during the excitement, I sort of have a crush on Jewel Staite. And my wife is aware of my crush on Jewel Staite. So we go into the meet and greet, and just sort of in the excitement of it, I inadvertently pushed past my wife to get to Jewel Staite. And both my wife and Alan Tudyk noticed that I did this. And I had to hear about it for a few days afterwards. But you know, you live, you learn, but I regret nothing. Anyway, but some of us maybe have had that chance to meet somebody famous. It could be a celebrity or an athlete. It could be a politician or a leader, somebody important. It could even be church leaders, somebody that's a famous pastor. So we've had those chances to meet somebody important. But just meeting them and shaking hands or getting a picture or a photo op doesn't mean we really know them. Now, some of you maybe have that connection. I don't. But it doesn't mean, we might know some statistics. We might know some details about their lives. We might even have that picture hanging on our wall in our office or our study. But it doesn't mean we know them and that they know us. And before Jesus came, this was kind of like the relationship that the Jewish people had with God. They knew a lot about God, and they followed, and they were obedient, and they had prayers and rituals that they went through, but their relationship was a lot different than we consider our relationship and our availability to have a relationship with God today. In this time, the temple contained a veil or a curtain, which you'll see on the picture there, and it separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is in the far back where the Ark of the Covenant resided. And so it was they believed that God actually dwelt above the seat above the Ark of the Covenant. So they believed that was basically, well, lack for a better term, that was God's crib for them. But they believed that's where God went, that God lived and resided there. And so the veil was one of the most ornate objects. I mean, it was large, as you can see, and it was one of the more ornate objects. It was made of fine linen and blue and purple and scarlet yarn. And you have to remember, they didn't have sewing machines, so everything was made by hand. And these skilled craftsmen would embroider figures on it of cherubim, angelic beings who would protect the throne of God. And there were even golden statues of 2 winged cherubim also knelt on the cover of the ark. And then throughout the Bible, we see that cherubim are the only living beings that the Israelites, that God gave them permission to make images of. And then there were also 4 pillars of acacia wood overlaid with gold and with silver bases that supported the veil, and it hung by silver hooks and clasps. And once a year, on the Day of Atonement, which was, I think this year it's going to be April, I think 8th and 9th, so it's, or not April, October rather, it was around the beginning of October. That was the only time of the year that the high priest could part this veil and enter the Holy of Holies and into the presence of God. And they believed that sin was such a serious matter that there were all kinds of rituals, cleansing rituals, and things that they had to do before the priest could enter in. And they were even so scared that maybe the priest had missed something that they would tie a rope with a bell around their ankle, and if the bell stopped moving, they would try to pull the priest out, assuming that he had been struck dead by God because he'd messed up. Could you imagine the fear of that priest walking into the Holy of Holies? Could you imagine like a worry that, well, what if I missed a sin, or what if I missed a word, or what if I didn't do something right? What if I'm just a little bit unclean and God strikes me down? For Christians, this might seem sort of a weird idea to have like one place where God dwells with us. Like one place where you could expect God to be. Today, if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see the Wailing Wall, or the wall outside of the temple. Jews are not allowed on the Temple Mount. And so the temple is, you'll see everybody get as close to the left corner if you're facing it as they can, because that's as close to what they believe the Holy of Holies or the Holy of Holies used to be. That's as close as they're able to get. So they all kind of congregate in that corner so they can be near to God. Could you even imagine that, being like the only way you could be near to God is to go to this place and try to scooch as close as you possibly could to this corner, and that's as close to God as you could ever get. But see, for us Christians, something symbolic happened on the cross. When Christ breathed his last breath and he gave up his spirit, Matthew 27 tells us that the veil of the temple was torn. It was rent. It was torn in two. We believe that at that point in time, this barrier was symbolic, that this barrier between us and God was gone, and that Jesus took its place. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20 from the Message says it this way, and I really like how he says this. He says, "So friends, we can now, without hesitation, walk right up to God, into the holy place. Jesus has cleared the way by the blood of his sacrifice, acting as our priest before God. The curtain into God's presence is his body. It's Jesus' body. That veil, that curtain is now Jesus." But see, unlike this veil that hung in the temple, it doesn't keep us out because of our sin. When we come through the veil of Jesus, we're cleansed of our sin. You see the difference? You don't have to do all this stuff before you open the veil. You come to the veil, you come to Jesus, and Jesus does the cleaning for you. But see, the problem is that we choose to keep that veil there, and I don't mean Jesus. We choose to put that barrier between us and God, and we do it for many reasons, but we just keep our distance. Jesus is inviting us in. He's inviting us to come to him and through him into God's presence, but we keep turning down the invitation. Probably the biggest excuse I've seen is that people just don't feel worthy. We feel kind of like that priest. Could you imagine if you had to be that priest and go back in and move that veil? And I think a lot of us still keep that in place. Like, we feel like we got to do this cleansing ritual before we can approach God, before we can come to Jesus. And we feel like we're not worthy, and we're too broken or unclean or dirty or sinful or damaged. And so we say, well, wait a second, I'll come to Jesus, but I got to get some stuff right first. How many times have we heard that? How many times have we said that? That we just don't feel like we're worthy enough to enter in to Jesus' presence. So we try to fix ourselves, we try to clean ourselves, we try to make ourselves right, but guess what? It doesn't work, because the only way we can be made right with God is through Jesus and what he did on the cross for us. There's nothing you can do to cleanse yourself. It's Jesus that does that work. And it's through Jesus' death on the cross that we're made worthy. We're in the middle of our study, He Chose the Nails by Max Lucado, and last week in the study, this phrase was said when it talks about what Jesus has done for us, and as we talked about forgiveness. It says that it was through Jesus' blood and the sacrifice on the cross that we are made whole and holy. Do you like the thought of that? That through Jesus you are made complete, you are made whole. And through Jesus, you are made holy. You are cleansed of everything that you've ever done. And that through Jesus, you're able to stand before God complete and unblemished. But to do that, we have to accept the invitation that Jesus offers to us. We have to accept Jesus as the veil, and we have to walk through him and enter into a relationship with him. I think sometimes, though, we get confused because we're not quite sure what that means. We question our relationship with him, and we doubt where we stand with him. And we're not sure what it means to really follow Jesus, so we kind of go through the motions, or we try to do certain things, but then we still in the back of our mind have those doubts. Well, what if I'm not made right? I remember when I was in college, I would wake up early on some mornings during the winter, and it'd still be a little bit dark out. And if you'd wake up on certain mornings and you'd walk into the bathroom to shower and get ready for class, and nobody's in there, and it's just really eerily quiet. So then you start looking around, and you're like, oh, what if Jesus returned and I'm the only one left? I went to a Christian college, so there was a fear of that. If you go to secular university, never mind. But there's that fear. What if I'm not right? What if Jesus returns and I get left because, I did that thing the other day. I said that word. I was mean to somebody. I did this or that. Because we think that coming to Jesus and following Jesus means we have to be these perfect Christian robots. We think that we have to be perfect, that we can't make a mistake, and that we have to sort of dress and act and be a certain way. We think that we can't be normal. But this is what the Apostle Paul tells us we're supposed to do. And again, this is also from the Message, and I really, really like this one. This is from Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. So here's what I want you to do. God helping you, take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Read what he says in that first line again. God helping you. You don't have to do it by yourself. And this is the part that we miss, is that we miss that God's going to help us through this. We think that we're going it alone, but God is there to help. You also have this body of believers. You have the church, and you have fellow Christians too. See, God, though, invites us to come to him through Jesus, and that he will help us day to day. In his book, Lucado says that he believes that without even realizing it, we live as if God is in holy places, but not in every place. Or that God is at work at that time, but he's not at work in our time. God is present over there, but God's not present right here. That God could show up then, but he's not going to show up now. Or that God is present in the sacred things, but not the secular things. See, what that means is we compartmentalize God. We put him in a nice, neat little box, and we invite him into parts of our lives, but we don't open the box up to all of our lives. We invite him into the holy, but we don't invite him into the ordinary. What would your life look like if you invited God into the ordinary? Would your life look like if you invited God into work, into getting breakfast ready in the morning, into sitting at the doctor's office, into getting your oil changed, into going through the car wash? I'm thinking all the boring things that we do, all those times that you're on Facebook because you had nothing else to do. What if we invited God into those moments, into the boring stuff? Better yet, what if we invited the boring stuff into God? What if instead of inviting God into our schedule, we built our schedule around our relationship with God? Do you see the difference? Instead of trying to squeeze God into what we've already set, we're putting God first, and then we're just building everything else around our relationship with him. In biblical times, if someone was a follower of or a disciple of a rabbi, they would go with them wherever they went. They would go with them through the countryside, and they would sit at their feet while they taught. They were as close to them as they could possibly be. So much so that because of all of the dust and the dirt of walking on the roads at that time, it was often said that you could tell how devoted a disciple was by how much of their rabbi's dust they had on them, because they'd kick that dust up. And so they would be covered in the dust of their rabbi. Whose dust are you covered in? Are you covered in the dust of Jesus because you follow him so closely in your day-to-day life? Or are you covered in the dust of our culture? Have you become, as Romans 12 said, so well adjusted to our culture that you fit right in? See, I think this is the other problem that we put this veil up, because we love the world so much that we're afraid that if we let that veil down, that God might make us change something, that we may have to give up something we don't want to give up. That we might have to change that career or that hobby or change how I live with my family and my friends and how I spend my finances. So what happens is our fear of this is what causes us to compartmentalize our relationship with God. God, I will let you into these areas, but this is mine. You can't have it. Now, I'm not a doomsdayer that thinks God is out to get us, but I think sometimes if God wants it, God's going to come take it. If there's a part of your life that you're keeping away from God, God's going to try to get in there. You may not like it. But see, the problem is when we compartmentalize, then we only meet God in the holy places. Is the only time you meet God Sunday mornings between 9:30 and 10:30? Is that the only time you meet God? Is it like, all right, God, I'm going to open the box. Okay, it's 10:30. I'm going to put you back in again. I'll see you next week. It happens. But see, what we are missing is that when we invite or we accept Jesus' invitation, when we walk through that veil and we enter into that relationship with God, our lives change so much for the better. And I don't remember the words that Kim used. It was something about investment. But the idea that the more you invest, the more you'll get back out of that. And if you're only investing pennies in your relationship with Jesus, it's no wonder you're like, well, this really doesn't do any difference in my life. Look at it this way. Sometimes it's addition by subtraction. You have to give something up, but you'll get even more in return. But you don't have to take my word for it. Last week during the message, Pastor Jan shared a video. As the praise team comes forward, we shared a video about cardboard testimonies. And this is where you write a situation on one side, a place that you have been struggling. or had been struggling. And then on the backside, you write how God is working or has worked to deliver you from that situation. And so we want to give you all a chance to do your own cardboard testimonies for next week during worship. So out in the gathering space, you will see a table with poster board. We ask that you write your name, the service you attend, and then we want you to write a place where you have struggled, something that you've been sort of dealing with. However God is leading you to share. And then on the other side, we want you to write how God has delivered or is delivering you from the situation, how God has worked or is working through you. And the next week during worship, we're going to invite you to come and share those with the congregation. And the idea behind this is for us to not only recognize what God has done and is doing in our lives, but it's to let other people know that God works this way. It's to let other people know that God can work in that situation, but you have to give it to Him. So this morning, as I close, I want to ask again, whose dust are you covered in? When people look at you, do they see the remnants of the world, of the culture? Or do they see the remnants of a relationship with Jesus Christ? And do they see the work that He is doing in your life? And do they see how God is working in you and through you? Because you may or may not know it, but people do watch us, and they are watching you. If you profess faith, if you say you go to church, if they have any inclination that you believe in God, they're watching to see how you live.